The moment Commander Varnus Threx felt the pulse of his fleet's guns rip through the cold expanse of space, the taste of steel and ionized air filled his mouth. The Kzarran armada was moving in, poised to crush the fragile humans beneath the heel of their superior might. Earth, a small, irrelevant dot of blue and green, would be swallowed by the might of the Kzarran Empire, or so he thought. "Target the largest fleet formations," Varnus barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the thick tension in the command room. His mandibles clicked in satisfaction as his orders sliced through the air, a sound more felt than heard. The command center was alive with the rapid staccato of plasma cannons being primed, the whirring of advanced targeting systems aligning. Laser plasma displays flickered before his eyes, each moment feeding him streams of data on the approaching enemy. His officers moved with efficient calm, their eyes fixed on the rotating readouts, their hands a blur on the controls. But something in the air felt heavier today. "Firing now," came the report, followed by the sharp release of energy that lit up the dark void. The Kzarran weapons, designed to shred planetary defenses, unleashed their fury at Earth's defenses. He could almost see the destruction unfold, a fiery ball of heat where once there had been human warships. And yet, something was wrong. The hum of victory did not fill his chest. Varnus's antennae twitched uneasily as he studied the laser plasma feeds. The human ships, they were not crumbling like the others. Instead, they danced around the incoming projectiles with an agility that seemed unnatural. The Kzarran fleet was supposed to be unstoppable. Their weapons, forged in the heart of collapsing stars, should have torn through the fragile humans like a hot knife through butter. Yet the humans, they moved like predators. "They've done it again, Commander," Lieutenant Greth said, her voice a low whisper of disbelief, her claws dancing across the heads-up display. "Their formation, it's not random. It's a deliberate counter-strategy." Her words hung in the air, laden with a realization that began to gnaw at the edges of Varnus's mind. "They can't possibly be outmaneuvering us," Varnus growled, his voice trembling slightly, the cold realization seeping in. But it wasn't possible, not for a species still crawling out of its primitive shell, still clinging to the remnants of fossil fuel-powered warships. Yet there it was. The humans were defying all logic. "Deploy the second wave now," he ordered, his voice sharp as ice. The orders flew from his lips, each one an attempt to wrestle control from the growing unease that tightened his chest. But as the second wave advanced, Varnus's unease only deepened. Through the thickly plated windows of the command pod, Varnus could see the jagged outlines of Earth's cities below, their lights flickering in the distance like fireflies against the endless night. The human resistance wasn't faltering. In fact, they were pushing back with an intensity he hadn't anticipated. "Commander," Greth interrupted, her voice trembling now, a sharp edge of panic creeping through her composure. "We've just received a report. The human fleet, they're using our own weaponry against us." Varnus's eyes narrowed, his vision locked on the laser plasma display. The human ships, once thought to be fragile, now tore into the advancing Kzarran forces with a ferocity that should have been impossible. Their weapons were crude, mismatched, and yet they adapted in ways that were almost unnerving. "They shouldn't even be capable of this," Varnus muttered, his mandibles clenching so tightly he feared they might crack. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, was fogged with an emotion he had never known: fear. The humans had an unpredictability that even the Kzarran fleet could not match. Each maneuver felt like a calculated response to his every move, a terrifying reflection of their uncanny ability to read the battlefield like a living, breathing entity. "Command ship has been hit," came the voice of Zash, a young officer stationed at the auxiliary controls. His words were calm, but his face was pale as he stared at the glowing red warning that blinked across his console. "Hull integrity compromised." "How?" Varnus snapped, his gaze locked on Zash, a quiet fury building within him. "Their fire. It's guided," Zash stammered, eyes wide with disbelief. "It adapts. It anticipates." Varnus stared at the screen, his eyes tracing the path of a missile that had somehow evaded their shield arrays. The missile wasn't just a projectile. It was a living, breathing thing, bending and shifting mid-flight as if it had been designed with a mind of its own. The notion shook him to his core. Humans were not just responding to the attack. They were learning, evolving. And with each moment, they were becoming a force no Kzarran had ever encountered. A cold sweat trickled down his spine. He had underestimated them. It was a mistake he could not afford to make again. "Retreat the first wave," Varnus ordered, his voice as sharp as the cold steel of his ship's hull. The words stung, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth, but he had no choice. Every Kzarran victory was built on dominance, and that dominance was crumbling faster than he could process. But the humans were relentless. The second wave was hit before it even made contact with the surface. Their tactics weren't just reactive, they were proactive, hunting down every weakness, striking faster than any Kzarran had ever seen. His mind raced, grasping for control, for a plan. The Kzarrans' technological superiority should have been enough. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, Varnus realized that this was not a war he could win with brute force. His gaze fell on the heads-up display, now flooded with red indicators signaling the loss of more ships. "Send the message to the Council," Varnus muttered, his voice hoarse. Tell them the truth. Humans are too dangerous to fight." His antennae drooped as the weight of his words settled on him. The Kzarran Empire had always prided itself on being invincible, untouchable. But as the final remnants of their fleet scrambled to escape Earth's orbit, Varnus knew he had made a grave error. The truth was undeniable. Humanity had changed the rules of warfare. For the first time in his career, Varnus felt small, his empire's might fading into nothingness. He had underestimated them, and now it was too late to turn back. And as the cold void of space swallowed the retreating Kzarran fleet, Varnus couldn't shake the image of Earth, a planet of children, of survivors, of warriors, standing undefeated against the galaxy's might. The retreat was swift. The Kzarran armada limped back, not in glorious defeat but in a kind of stunned collapse, their once proud warships now tarnished and shaken by the unexpected ferocity of their human adversaries. Commander Varnus Threx stood motionless in the command pod, his sharp mandibles barely twitching as he watched the final remnants of his fleet break orbit. The laser plasma displays around him flickered with streams of retreat data, each report a slap to his ego, each loss a cold weight sinking deeper into his chest. The human ships were far from the primitive toys they had first appeared to be. They didn't just retaliate, they adapted. Every strike against them seemed to fuel their resolve, sharpening their instincts, pushing them into overdrive. Even as Varnus watched, the heads-up displays began to show the human fleet adjusting their formations, faster, more synchronized. It was as if they had been waiting for this, preparing for this war their entire existence. "Send a message to the fleet. I want every ship in the third wave ready to launch," Varnus growled, his voice tight. His eyes were locked on the battlefield outside the command pod. The once crystal-clear view of Earth's surface now appeared as a distant, unwelcoming planet, its blue oceans rippling in the cold light of space. The human resistance had caught them off guard, but this time they would be ready. Or so he hoped. "Commander, you need to see this." Greth's voice broke through the tension, her claws tapping at the control panel in front of her. Varnus turned, his gaze cold but curious. On the heads-up display, a live feed began to pulse with chaotic data. It was the aftermath of the first wave's failed assault. The remnants of human resistance were being mopped up, but the footage was chilling. A small, battered human ship, its hull scratched and torn from the Kzarran bombardment, moved with unnatural grace. Varnus narrowed his eyes. The ship was not retreating. It was following, pursuing the Kzarran fleet with a determination that felt almost alive, as if it had been trained to hunt. "What in the void is that?" Varnus whispered, leaning closer to the display. The ship weaved through the debris of the previous battles, using the very destruction caused by his own fleet as cover. It was too erratic, too fast, moving like a shadow, each evasive maneuver tighter than the last. It was clear now, this wasn't just a primitive species. It was a species that had learned how to fight in the deepest of ways. They're learning, Greth said, her voice trembling with disbelief. We hit them, and they evolve their tactics instantly. Their resistance isn't blind. They're calculating everything. The commander's antennae stiffened, the dread creeping back up his spine. He had known that humanity was resilient, but this was something else. They didn't just survive, they thrived in chaos, adapting with a speed that made Varnus's teeth clench. Keep tracking them, he ordered, his voice rough. His eyes darted across the display, analyzing their every move. The ship was still there, still chasing. Not just chasing, but hunting. It was testing them. All units prepare for full battle coordination, he barked, turning his focus back to his fleet. The command room hummed with the urgency of the order, the air electric with the tension. The officer beside him, a young tactical strategist named Zash, didn't flinch at his words, but his face paled as he studied the data. Commander, the human ship, it's doing the impossible. It's intercepting our signals, Zash said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're anticipating our moves. Every frequency we change, they're one step ahead. Varnus's heart raced, his grip tightening on the console. A sudden sharp jolt ran through the ship, and the lights flickered. He turned his head to see another officer, his face grim, his eyes wide. Commander, we've lost contact with the rear fleet, the officer shouted, his claws shaking. A single human vessel, just one, has disabled the rear guard's communication array. Varnus felt the world tilt on its axis. His fleet was breaking down faster than he could process. The human ship had outsmarted them. Again, one ship. It should have been easy to obliterate, but instead, it had infiltrated and neutralized Kzarran tech with an ingenuity that defied logic. His eyes flicked over to Greth, who was still watching the laser plasma feeds. Bring the third wave online now, Varnus commanded, his voice like ice. The words were hollow. His fleet was crumbling, and the human ships were swarming, acting like an invasive force, calculating every move as though they were playing a game of chess with lives at stake. On the surface of Earth, the humans' capital city, once a distant, insignificant spot on his map, seemed to pulse with its own life force. The relentless energy of the humans now felt palpable. He could see the giant, fire-ravaged cityscape, and amidst the chaos, the humans had done what no enemy had done before. They began regrouping. They were not cowering. They were evolving, gathering their broken fleets into something far more dangerous. How are they doing this? Greth muttered, disbelief written in every part of her. She leaned forward, her claws almost trembling as she tapped on the controls. They're taking our ships and turning them into weapons. The words hung in the air. His mind struggled to process them, his thoughts tumbling over themselves, turning them into weapons. It was almost too much to believe, but as the feeds began to show, the human ships using captured Kzarran tech, the truth was undeniable. The humans were reverse engineering his most advanced systems in real time. Deploy the shield reconfigurations. Double down on frequency distortions. We need to slow them down, Varnus growled, his voice tight with anger. His fleet was being picked apart, bit by bit, and the more he fought to control it, the faster it slipped away. As the chaos escalated around him, Varnus felt his stomach churn, a mixture of disgust and disbelief gnawing at his insides. It wasn't just the technology, their understanding, their speed. It was their unyielding will to fight. He had never faced an enemy that could turn fear into fuel so quickly. There was no break in the storm. Every calculated move they made felt like a knife to his empire. The feeds blinked once more, showing images of destroyed Kzarran warships, twisted and broken, human vessels swarming over them, picking them apart for parts, reassembling them into something unfamiliar. This is not a war, Varnus whispered, his eyes narrowing as the weight of what was happening began to sink in. This is a battle for survival. Commander, more ships incoming, Zash said, his voice still tinged with fear. The humans are not just fighting. They're evolving faster than we ever expected. They're learning how to destroy us. Varnus turned away from the console, his mind struggling to grasp the situation. They were not just outmatched. They were outwitted. The battle was already over, And Earth, this insignificant, pathetic planet, had just turned the tables. "Prepare for the worst," he murmured. "We might have underestimated them, but now we've given them a reason to win." The hum of tension in the command room was palpable, even in the vacuum of space. Commander Varnus Threx stood rigid before the laser plasma displays, his sharp mandibles pressed together in frustration. His fleet was battered, its edges frayed by the relentless human tactics, and the sense of impending defeat weighed heavily on his mind. Outside the command pod's reinforced windows, the Earth loomed, a small blue-green planet, pulsing with energy and mystery. The same planet that should have been nothing more than a footnote in the Kzarran Empire's expansion. Now it seemed more like a ticking bomb, alive with something Varnus couldn't fully understand. "Commander?" Greth's voice broke the silence, thick with a barely contained tension. "They're doing it again. The humans have adapted. They've found a way to bypass our secondary shields." Varnus's antennae twitched as his eyes flicked to the heads-up display. Greth's words were not just alarming. They were a grim confirmation. It wasn't just that the humans were fighting back. They were studying the Kzarran fleet, dissecting every weakness, every flaw, and exploiting it with terrifying speed. "Deploy more countermeasures," Varnus barked, his voice cracking like thunder against the silent, cold air of the command pod. His hands clenched into fists, the sharp ache of frustration building in his chest. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The Kzarran Empire had crushed planets before, easily, swiftly, but these humans, these creatures, were showing them an entirely different kind of fight. Their adaptive nature was almost unnatural. The heads-up displays flickered, and Varnus's eyes locked onto the new data. A massive human warship had broken through their defensive perimeter, its cannons lighting up like a storm in the dark void. The ship's design was crude, almost primitive compared to the sleek, engineered elegance of the Kzarran fleet. And yet, it was unstoppable, each shot landing with deadly precision. The humans had figured out how to infiltrate their systems, adapting their offensive tactics with unnerving efficiency. "How are they doing this?" Zash asked from the tactical station, his voice raw with disbelief. "It's like they're inside our systems, anticipating our moves, adjusting their tactics as we do." "Impossible," Greth muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. Her sharp claws clicked against the console. "We should be the ones evolving, not them." Varnus stared at the display, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The humans' counterattacks weren't just random acts of resistance. They were strategic, intelligent, almost calculated. In every confrontation, they were learning from their mistakes, adapting to the chaos in ways that made them more dangerous with each encounter. The humans weren't fighting as though they were part of the present. They were fighting as if they were already living in the future, mastering the very art of survival. "Pull the rear guard back," Varnus growled, his eyes never leaving the screen. His voice was tight, the weight of realization beginning to settle in. "We're too exposed. They know our weaknesses now. We need to reposition." But it was too late. The first breach had already happened, and it was only the beginning. The Kzarran fleet had started losing ships one by one, as human vessels darted through the flares of fire and destruction, their advanced missile systems seeping through gaps in the Kzarran shields like poison. One of the Kzarran warships, a flagship, was caught in the explosion of a human missile, its exterior armor cracking like ice under the weight of a sudden strike. The chaos inside the ship was like a violent storm, a flash of sparks, shouts, and chaos, as the once mighty vessel was torn apart from within. Varnus could feel the loss in his bones. The flagship represented everything the Kzarran Empire stood for, its power, its authority. And now it was nothing more than floating debris. "Commander," Zash spoke again, his voice more subdued this time, as though trying to mask the anxiety creeping into his voice. "We've received a transmission from the humans. It's strange." Varnus turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "Put it through." The laser plasma display flashed, and a garbled message appeared. The transmission was oddly distorted, a strange form of static crackling over the communication. At first it made no sense. Blips, fragments, and garbled speech filled the display. Then, in the midst of it, a single chilling sentence broke through the noise. "We're waiting." It echoed through the command pod like an aftershock, sending a shiver through Varnus's crystalline exoskeleton. The words sent a wave of confusion and unease through the entire room. The humans had intercepted their communication, yes, but now they were speaking back, and the words were cryptic, unnerving. "We're waiting," Zash echoed, his voice faltering. "For what?" Varnus's eyes hardened. He didn't know. He couldn't even begin to understand what the humans were playing at. It was clear now. This was more than just an invasion. It was a game, a deadly game, and the humans weren't simply trying to repel the Kzarran. They were trying to force them into something, push them into a trap. "What have they done?" Greth asked, her voice sharp. Her claws hovered over the console, her breath barely a whisper. "What have they built?" The command pod was silent, each officer lost in the implications of their situation. The humanity that Varnus had once thought to be weak and defenseless was, in truth, a far greater enemy than he could have imagined. The humans weren't fighting for mere survival. They were fighting for something deeper, something more fundamental. And then, the first ship of the third wave was hit. The explosion was violent, an unholy burst of light and heat that rocked the entire fleet. The force of the blast sent shockwaves through the command pod, rattling Varnus's bones. His antennae flattened instinctively, and for a brief moment he thought the ship might be torn apart by the sheer force of the destruction. He heard the frantic shouts of his officers, the clang of metal reverberating through the walls. It wasn't the missile that struck him. It was the realization. The humans weren't reacting in the way any normal species would. They weren't trying to gain control. They were trying to dismantle the Kzarran Empire piece by piece, taking advantage of every single mistake they made, forcing them into a war of attrition where the very foundation of Kzarran superiority was slowly slipping away. In that brief moment, Varnus understood the scale of the enemy before him. The humans had not only prepared for this war, they had anticipated it. They knew exactly how to cripple him, how to drain the Kzarran might like the slow bleed of a dying star. And as the third wave fell apart, torn to shreds by human ingenuity, Varnus's thoughts turned dark. They weren't waiting anymore. The humans were testing. They had pushed him, forced his hand, and now it was becoming clear. They were learning faster than he could adapt. He turned away from the chaos unfolding on the laser plasma displays, his mind racing as the weight of the situation finally began to settle. Whatever came next, it was no longer in his hands. The humans had just changed the rules of this game, and the question now was, would Varnus survive it? Varnus Threx stood motionless as the screen before him blazed with frantic red flashes, each one representing another loss, another piece of his fleet being swallowed by the chaos. His sharp eyes were fixed on the laser plasma display, the images of his forces scattered in disarray flickering across his mind like a bad dream. The raw heat from the destruction of the third wave still pulsed through the command pod, the faint reverberation of the explosion still shaking the walls. It was a familiar sensation, but it should not be happening to the Kzarran Empire. "Commander, we've lost the Vreloth." Greth's voice cut through the tension, thick with disbelief. The Vreloth was a battlecruiser, an elite vessel. Varnus's eyes never wavered, though his antennae drooped slightly. The Vreloth was not just any ship. It was a symbol of Kzarran power, a vessel designed to withstand the harshest of blows and strike back with overwhelming force. Losing it to a mere human ship, a battered thing with shields barely functional, was an insult. The Vreloth had been crippled by a human tactic so simple, so primal, that it felt like an absurdity. The human ship had simply rammed it, a kamikaze strike seemingly born of desperation, but somehow devastating in its execution. "How could they have known to counter that tactic?" Varnus muttered, his voice barely audible. His mind churned, piecing together the impossible. The humans had seen it coming. They had anticipated their every move, even the moves that no one in the galaxy would consider. They weren't just fighting. They were thinking faster, adapting quicker. "Keep the perimeter tight," Varnus ordered, his voice sharpening as he clung to the remnants of his composure. "We can't afford another failure. Launch the remaining fighters." His words felt hollow as they left his lips. The third wave had been a disaster, and now the Vreloth was gone, its remains floating in the dark vacuum of space like a carcass of a once proud beast. Varnus's heart clenched as he thought of the Kzarran crew, their shattered forms drifting in the cold void. The human ship's ramming maneuver had been a direct violation of all warfare rules, but it had worked. The Kzarran fleet was unraveling, and nothing he ordered seemed to stop it. He shifted his attention to the heads-up display again. The humans weren't letting up. They were moving fast, like creatures in the wild, circling their prey. The Kzarran fleet was surrounded on all sides now. A human formation of small, agile ships was darting through the wreckage of the third wave, their sleek hulls almost ghostly in the darkness. There was no time to waste. The Kzarran ships had already sustained significant damage. Their defensive capabilities were stretched thin, and every maneuver they made was being countered almost immediately. "They're learning from each of our failures," Zash said from his station, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't need to say it aloud, but the meaning was clear. The humans had already adapted to the Kzarran ways of warfare. "Yes, they are," Varnus replied grimly. "And they are doing so faster than we can counter them. We can't allow them to learn anything else." He could feel the pressure mounting. Each loss, each devastating blow to the fleet felt like a wound to the Empire's very soul. The Kzarran had been the apex species for centuries, unchallenged. But here they were, facing a species that didn't just fight for survival, they fought for something else. Varnus couldn't quite grasp what that something was, but it was enough to destroy his empire piece by piece. "Incoming message from the fleet," Greth announced, her voice strained. "They say there's a disturbance." The laser plasma display flickered momentarily, the message bursting across the screen. The words were brief, but they told enough. "We've detected something unexpected, something we can't identify." Varnus's brow furrowed. "What kind of disturbance?" The feed was grainy, but what appeared next was a sight Varnus had not been prepared for. Through the visual distortion, he could make out the outline of one of the Kzarran cruisers. The ship's hull was dark, almost unrecognizable, its exterior marred by burns and jagged edges. The crew was silent, as if they had already accepted their fate. But it was what happened next that made Varnus's blood run cold. A small human vessel, barely visible against the backdrop of debris, appeared from behind the cruiser. With no warning, the human ship launched an unexpected salvo, a salvo that tore through their own wreckage, as if orchestrating an attack from inside the very ruin they had created. It was almost like the human ships were dancing, using the destroyed Kzarran ships as part of their battle strategy, as if the very debris was being weaponized against them. "They're using our wreckage to destroy us," Greth whispered in disbelief. "They're turning our losses into their advantages." Varnus's mind raced, his eyes glued to the display. The humans weren't just learning, they were teaching themselves how to dismantle the Kzarran Empire in real time. Every destroyed Kzarran ship became a new weapon in their arsenal. They were not only surviving, they were evolving with every attack, turning every setback into an opportunity. It was madness. It was brilliant. It was something Varnus had never encountered. "Command ship reports severe damage," came the voice of another officer, distant but clear. "We've lost communications. The fleet's integrity is compromised." Varnus's vision blurred as the weight of the situation hit him like a wave. It was no longer about winning. It was about surviving. And right now, survival was looking increasingly uncertain. The humans were too cunning, too unpredictable. They were playing a game that no one in the galaxy had ever played before, and they were winning. His antennae twitched in silent fury, but the words he had to say were barely more than a whisper. "Initiate full retreat protocols. Every ship must withdraw to the secondary zone. Prepare for complete evacuation." As the order left his mouth, Varnus couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. They had underestimated the humans. Now the very core of the Kzarran Empire was cracking, its strength crumbling beneath the weight of a species that wasn't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something greater, something Varnus could not comprehend. The laser plasma displays flickered again, this time showing the humans' relentless advance. It was like the very essence of the battlefield had shifted. What had once been a war to conquer was now something else entirely. Varnus had no words, no strategy left to offer. The humans had taken the game into their hands. As his fleet retreated into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of their once imposing presence, Varnus felt something that he hadn't experienced in centuries. Fear. And it was the most terrifying thing of all. The weight of the retreat was suffocating. Commander Varnus Threx stood at the helm of his flagship, staring through the reinforced glass of the command pod. Beyond it, the sprawling void of space lay undisturbed, the stars glittering coldly. Earth, now a mere speck in the distance, remained a source of dread in his mind. He hadn't expected this war to drain his empire so quickly. Every retreat, every loss, gnawed at his pride, eroding the once imposing confidence he had carried into this conflict. The Kzarran fleet, once invincible, was now a fractured remnant, retreating from an enemy that, in Varnus's mind, shouldn't have been capable of this kind of resistance. The laser plasma displays surrounding him flickered with the latest updates from the fleet. Ships were scattered across the sector, some fleeing, some damaged beyond repair. The humans had not only been successful in repelling his forces, they had torn apart the very foundations of Kzarran superiority. Every maneuver, every counterattack by the humans had cut through their strategy like a knife. They adapted, evolved, and now their forces seemed unstoppable. "Commander, the enemy fleet is regrouping." Greth's voice was steady but tinged with frustration. "They're reinforcing their formations faster than we can track. It's as if they've predicted every movement." Varnus clenched his mandibles, feeling the burn of a rare emotion: panic. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but the action did little to suppress the sinking sensation in his chest. The Kzarran might have the most advanced technology in the galaxy, but these humans, they were something else entirely. Something that didn't just bend the rules, they created new ones. "Keep track of their movements," he muttered, his voice tight. "I want to know where every single human vessel is." His eyes darted to the laser plasma display, where the human fleet was forming once more, gathering in strength. Small, agile ships circled like predators, weaving between the debris fields left behind by the Kzarran destruction. It was as if the humans were studying their fallen enemies, picking through the wreckage with calm precision, salvaging what they could. "Commander," Zash's voice cut through the silence, this time barely masking the panic that seeped into his words. I can't explain this. The humans, they're not retreating. They're moving toward the inner systems." Varnus's breath caught in his throat. They were pressing forward, not backing down. They were hunting. "How are they doing this?" Varnus muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. How had a species this primitive, this seemingly fragile, turned the tables so decisively? He remembered the first moments of contact, how the humans had laughed in the face of the Kzarran Empire. He remembered the smirk on their faces as they refused to surrender. He had assumed they were simply arrogant. Now he realized that their arrogance was merely the outward sign of something far more dangerous. He stepped closer to the display, his eyes narrowing as the human ships neared his fleet's weakened flank. There was no mercy in their attack, no hesitation. They fought with a cold, relentless logic, but not like any force he had ever seen. There was no honor, no pride, no goal other than to destroy and consume everything in their path. It was chaos, yes, but it was calculated chaos. "Activate shields, double-layer them across the perimeter," he barked, his voice now sharp with the urgency that his officers had begun to sense. They scrambled to obey, but Varnus knew that shields, these shields, were not enough anymore. The humans had cracked them, twice, 3 times. The heads-up display flickered as the incoming data streamed in, each piece more damning than the last. The humans had adapted again. The once perfectly synchronized attack of the Kzarran fleet was now in disarray. It was too late to reorganize. too late to regain any semblance of the command that had once instilled fear in every race across the galaxy. "Commander, we've intercepted another message," Greth reported, her voice colder than before. "It's not a transmission. It's more like a challenge." Varnus turned, his gaze piercing. "A challenge?" "Yes," Greth said slowly. "They're daring us to engage. They're making a mockery of our retreat." Before Varnus could respond, the display shifted, and there it was, clear as day. A direct broadcast from the human fleet. A simple message written in stark white letters against a dark backdrop. "We're waiting for you." The words echoed like a bell tolling in the deep space around them. Varnus's heart sank. It was not the usual threats he had received from other races. It wasn't an offer of surrender or a plea for mercy. No, this was a challenge in its purest form. A taunt. A statement of power. "They're testing us," Varnus growled, his voice low, his fist tightened. "They think they can outlast us. They want us to come back and fight. They know we have no choice but to engage again." "Then we give them what they want," Greth said, her voice edged with frustration. "Do you think they fear us?" Zash asked, his voice full of disbelief. "They know we're far stronger than they are. They can't think they're capable of beating us." "They don't fear us," Varnus replied coldly, his eyes locked on the display, watching the human ships move closer, almost as if they were circling their prey. "They've already beaten us. They've taken our pride. They've broken our command. And now, they're waiting for us to give them a reason to finish it." There was a cold, bitter taste in his mouth as the realization settled over him. The humans weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting because they wanted to. Their victory wasn't about the destruction of the Kzarran fleet. It was about the unraveling of the Kzarran Empire's legacy. It was about proving something much larger, much deeper than a simple military conflict. The humans had turned the war into a test of will, a battle for dominance in a way that no species had ever dared challenge the Kzarran before. The stillness in the command pod became suffocating. The noise of the crew, the tapping of claws against control panels, faded into the background. Varnus stood frozen, his chest tight, as he realized that the Kzarran Empire was not just under attack, it was being reshaped, and the humans, with all their reckless ambition, were the architects of its fall. The laser plasma display began flashing once more, signaling the approach of the human fleet. The time had come. There would be no more retreats, no more strategies, no more warnings. This battle would determine everything. This battle would reveal what the humans had been building all along. "Prepare the fleet," Varnus commanded, his voice hard as steel. "This time we fight to win, or we die trying." His mind was already racing, formulating the last possible hope of victory, but the gnawing suspicion in the pit of his stomach told him it might be too late. The humans had already outplayed him. The only question now was whether he could find a way to outlast them, but in the back of his mind, a darker question lingered. Could the Kzarran Empire even survive the storm the humans had started? As the fleet readied itself for what would be their final stand, Varnus felt the weight of the universe bearing down on him. He turned one last time to the laser plasma displays, the symbols of Kzarran pride now flickering as if even they could sense the impending doom. The humans were waiting, and in that moment it was clear that no matter the outcome, they had already changed the very fabric of the Kzarran Empire. Their victory wasn't about the number of ships lost. It was about something far deeper, something intangible, and perhaps even irreversible. The moment the human fleet moved into position, Varnus felt the tremor in his core, as though the very fabric of space had shifted beneath his feet. His fleet was still struggling to reorganize, their ships limping in the void, bruised and bloodied. The Kzarran commanders, once so sure of their technological superiority, now stood uncertain in their command pods, staring into the heads-up displays as the human forces moved with eerie coordination. They weren't rushing. No. The humans were taking their time, circling, evaluating, planning, almost as if they were savoring the moment. "Commander," Greth's voice broke through the oppressive silence, tinged with a sense of dread. "They've matched our formation. Every movement we make, they make." Her claws clicked nervously against the panel in front of her. How are they this quick? Varnus didn't answer at first. He couldn't. He was too transfixed by the laser plasma display showing the human ships, those agile, unpredictable creatures, pressing forward. They weren't like anything he had ever fought. They moved with precision, yes, but it was a different kind of precision, one that defied the conventional methods of warfare. The humans didn't simply adapt. They anticipated. It was as if their entire species had been preparing for this moment for centuries, and now that it had come, they were running the show. "Commander, we've detected strange energy fluctuations," Zash said, his voice shaking with unease. "They're sending out some kind of signal. It's not like any communication we've intercepted before." Varnus narrowed his eyes at the display, watching the readings shift and pulse with an ominous rhythm. The humans were doing something new, something they hadn't shown before. But what? He couldn't decipher the signal. It was too erratic, too unpredictable. It felt wrong. "Lock onto the signal," Varnus ordered, his voice tight, a thread of frustration lacing through it. "I want to know exactly what they're doing." "Yes, Commander," Zash replied quickly. His hands flew over the control panel, trying to make sense of the data, but his face paled as the readings grew more complex. The seconds stretched into eternity. Every Kzarran ship seemed to slow, their movements growing more lethargic, more disjointed. The humans weren't engaging in direct combat yet. They were waiting, like a predator sizing up its prey. The Kzarran fleet, once the unchallenged force of the galaxy, had become the prey. Varnus could almost feel it, their pride, their might slipping away with each passing second. Then, with a sudden jolt, the signal was locked. "What is it?" Greth demanded, her voice taut with anticipation. I can't tell," Zash muttered, his eyes glued to the display. "It's shifting, like they're adapting in real time." Varnus stared at the screen, his vision narrowing, a cold dread creeping over him. There, on the edge of the display, the human fleet suddenly shuddered. Like a ripple through still water, their formations twisted and reformed, shifting at the same time, a coordinated movement so swift, so fluid, that it was impossible to follow. The Kzarran ships, in contrast, felt stuck, the difference as stark as the divide between predator and prey. "They're learning our movements," Greth whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "The signal, it's feedback. They're analyzing us." A deep, ominous silence settled over the command pod as the weight of her words hit. They weren't just fighting. The humans weren't just reacting to the Kzarrans' tactics. They were reverse engineering them, as if everything the Kzarran did was being analyzed and used against them in real time. "Commander," Zash's voice cracked, his eyes wide with horror. They've already adapted. The next wave, it's going to be worse." Varnus's chest tightened, his mind struggling to keep pace with the reality of their situation. His fleet was in disarray. The humans weren't just reacting. They were orchestrating a complete shift in the battle. The power had shifted. They had control now. "All units," Varnus barked, his voice rough with frustration. "Prepare to engage the humans. No more games. We end this now." His orders rang out like a futile attempt to restore some semblance of order. But deep inside, Varnus knew it was already too late. The humans had dissected everything, broken apart the Kzarran strategy, and now they were ready to tear it apart. Outside the command pod, the human ships surged forward. They didn't race. No, they drifted like shadowed wraiths, their engines purring softly as they aligned with devastating precision. There was no desperation in their movements, only quiet, measured purpose. It was as if they had rehearsed this moment, as if they had known exactly how the Kzarran would respond. "We need to fall back," Greth said, her voice shaking with unease. "The humans, they've already anticipated everything. We can't hold them off forever." Varnus stood motionless, the cold weight of the truth pressing down on him. The Kzarran fleet was already on the defensive, retreating before the human onslaught. He could see it now, the human fleet barely scratched, poised to take control of the sector. Their weapons were no longer just a threat. They were an inevitability. Every shot, every maneuver, was a precise strike, every action taken with the singular purpose of dismantling the Kzarran presence. In the distance, a series of explosions lit up the space around the Kzarran flagship. The lights flickered, and Varnus could hear the faint echoes of screams from the lower decks. His ship was under attack. The human fleet wasn't waiting for him to make the first move. They were already engaging, picking apart his forces with ruthless efficiency. "Commander, we've lost the Zorak," Zash said, his voice barely a whisper, the horror evident in his tone. "It's gone. We're being hunted." Varnus clenched his fists, the metallic claws digging into his palms. The Zorak had been one of their largest, most formidable vessels. It was gone now, torn apart by human tactics he could barely comprehend. They had used every weakness the Kzarran had ever shown, amplified it, and turned it into a weapon. "Retreat! Full retreat," Varnus said, the words bitter in his mouth, but there was no other choice. The humans had trapped them. The humans had won. But as the retreat orders echoed through the fleet, Varnus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The humans had shown no mercy, no hesitation. They had brought the fight to his doorstep, not just with their weapons, but with their unrelenting determination. And somehow he knew they were waiting for something more. They weren't finished. The question now was, what was their next move? The battle was slipping through his fingers like sand, but Varnus couldn't help but feel one last gnawing thought in his gut. What would the humans do next? Varnus Threx's mind raced, a storm of thoughts colliding with each other as the fleet reeled from the relentless assault. The humans had crushed the Kzarrans' vaunted superiority, dismantling their once unshakable presence in the galaxy piece by piece. The orders for retreat had been given, but the reality was clear. There was no escaping this. His fleet was crumbling, and the humans were closing in, their ships circling like wolves ready to strike. "Commander," Greth said, her voice laced with a quiet urgency. "They're not stopping. We can't keep retreating." Varnus's sharp eyes flicked to the heads-up display, where the human fleet loomed large, their ships advancing with calculated slowness, not in haste, but in a deliberate, cold rhythm. Each vessel moved in perfect coordination, their weapons at the ready, their movements unsettlingly assured. Varnus had once thought the Kzarran Empire was the most advanced force in the galaxy, but now, with every passing moment, it felt like an archaic relic of a bygone era, its dominance slipping away faster than he could comprehend. "Form the remaining ships into defensive positions," Varnus ordered, his voice sharper than he intended. His gaze lingered on the screen, watching as the human fleet closed the distance. There was no more room to retreat, no time to regroup. They had reached the final stage of this war, and it would either end in destruction or survival. "We don't have enough firepower to hold them off for long," Zash muttered from his station, his fingers hovering over the controls, ready to engage the few remaining weapon systems. "They'll outlast us." The words were a brutal truth. The Kzarran had been caught off guard by the humans' adaptability, their tactics shifting with every engagement, always one step ahead. Now the humans weren't just reacting, they were playing their own game, and it was clear that the Kzarran were losing. "We'll make our stand here," Varnus said, his voice low but resolute. "We hold the line, for as long as we can." Greth nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. She had fought beside Varnus through countless battles, but the enemy they now faced was unlike anything they had ever encountered. It wasn't just about technological advancement or firepower, it was about something deeper. The humans weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting with a purpose, and that purpose was to win. The last of the fleet's ships maneuvered into position, a defensive formation that would buy them a few more moments, but no more. Varnus could see the humans' movements on the display, their ships spreading out in a way that suggested they weren't merely preparing for the final attack, they were orchestrating a trap. "We need a plan," Zash said, his voice strained, as he glanced at Varnus. "We can't keep reacting to them. We need to take the initiative." Varnus stood still, eyes locked on the advancing human fleet. His mind churned, weighing his options. He had no illusions left. This would be no simple battle. The humans had outwitted him at every turn, and now, it seemed, they were more than capable of finishing what they had started. But there was still one thing the Kzarran had that the humans didn't: a weapon born of necessity. A weapon that would force the humans to rethink everything. "Prepare the Varka system," Varnus said, his voice hardening with determination. Greth looked up sharply. "The Varka? You're not seriously considering using that, are you?" "The humans have taken everything else from us," Varnus replied, his voice cold. "It's time we show them that there are consequences to their actions." The Varka system was a last resort weapon, a device of devastating potential. It was designed not to conquer, but to destroy. A weapon that, once activated, would render the entire sector uninhabitable. It was a desperate measure, one that could wipe out everything in its wake. But in that moment, Varnus knew it was their only option. He turned to Zash, his gaze hardening. "I need you to line up the sequence. No mistakes. Activate it once the fleet is in position." Zash hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the controls as though considering the weight of what he was about to do. But then, with a determined nod, he set to work. The heads-up displays blinked to life, showing the strategic positions of both fleets. The Kzarran ships were arrayed in a tight formation, their weapons trained on the oncoming human fleet. But the humans had already begun to make their move. Their ships flanked, circling with unerring accuracy, probing for weaknesses, like sharks in the water. "Commander, they're closing in," Greth warned. "We're running out of time." Varnus stood tall, his gaze never wavering. He knew what had to be done. "Initiate the Varka sequence now." The silence that followed was deafening. A cold shiver ran through the command pod as Zash entered the final sequence. The weapon would take moments to charge, and in that time the Kzarran fleet would have to hold their ground, even as the human ships moved in for the kill. "Target locked." Zash's voice was steady, though the tension was clear in his words. "Varka is charging." Varnus felt his pulse quicken. This was it. If the humans had anticipated every move up until now, they wouldn't be ready for this. The Varka would be their reckoning. It would force the humans to retreat, to reconsider their tactics. It was a weapon of pure destruction, one that didn't rely on advanced technology or careful planning. It relied on one thing: force. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like a lifetime. The human ships were closing in, but now they were within range. The Kzarran fleet's weapon systems hummed to life, their turrets swiveling to face the advancing human forces. The battle was about to reach its breaking point, and then the first shot rang out, a blinding flash of energy that cut through the darkness of space, followed by a storm of plasma bolts. The Kzarran fleet's guns roared to life, firing in rapid succession, each shot landing with devastating impact on the human ships. But the humans, even now, didn't falter. They darted through the fire, weaving with an agility that made them seem almost untouchable. "Now!" Varnus commanded, his voice a final command. The Varka weapon fired. A surge of energy rippled across the sector, lighting up the blackness of space with an intensity so bright it was blinding. For a moment, the entire field seemed to crackle with raw power. The Varka's energy wave spread outward, its destructive force sending shock waves through the human fleet. And then, silence. For a heartbeat, it seemed like the world had stopped. The laser plasma displays flickered, but the data was slow to arrive. Varnus's eyes scanned the screen, his breath catching in his chest. The human fleet had been hit, but not destroyed. They were still there, tattered, but intact. The Kzarran fleet had fought with everything they had, and yet the humans had endured. The silence that followed the Varka blast felt oppressive, like the entire universe had paused to hold its breath. The screens in front of Varnus flickered, showing distorted data, slow to refresh, as the energy wave from the weapon spread outward. His heart pounded in his chest, his antennae twitching in nervous anticipation. The heads-up displays were still struggling to process the full scope of the destruction, but one thing was clear. The Varka had not wiped out the human fleet. They were still there. Not only were they still there, they were still fighting. The remnants of the human fleet, battered but not broken, pushed forward, their ships flying in tight formation, their weapons flashing with an energy that was far too relentless for a species that should have been crushed by now. The explosion from the Varka had torn through part of their formation, yes, but the humans had endured. Their ships still darted through the debris, their movements coordinated with a fluidity that belied their primitive tech. The Kzarran fleet had given everything they had, and yet the humans were still here. Varnus clenched his mandibles. His gaze never left the screen. He was watching the impossible unfold in real time. Humanity, against all odds, had taken the fight to the Kzarran, and they had won. "Commander?" Greth's voice was hollow, almost a whisper. They're adapting again. We've lost our advantage." The words struck Varnus harder than any weapon could. Adapting again. He could see it now. The humans had learned from the destruction. They were no longer just responding. They were anticipating the next move, the next weakness. The Varka's power had not broken them. It had only strengthened their resolve. "Keep firing," Varnus barked, his voice hoarse with the weight of frustration. "We fight to the end." But even as the command left his lips, he knew it was too late. The Kzarran fleet was a dying animal, struggling to hold on as the humans closed in. There was no honor in this defeat, no glory to be found. The humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving in this chaos. They were not playing by the rules, not following the script of war that every other species adhered to. They were rewriting it. "Commander, we have incoming communications," Zash said, his voice trembling. The officers around him paused, their hands hovering over their consoles. It's from their fleet." Varnus's heart skipped a beat. Communications? They had been in battle for so long he hadn't expected the humans to reach out. But as the message began to stream across the laser plasma displays, Varnus felt a shiver run down his spine. The humans were speaking, not with threats, not with demands. They were speaking with something far more dangerous: humor. The message was simple. The words scrolled across the screen. "Thanks for the upgrades. Come back anytime." The words lingered in the air like poison. It wasn't just a message of defiance. It was a declaration of victory. The humans had not only beaten them in battle, they had stripped the Kzarran fleet of its dignity, torn apart the myth of their invincibility, and turned the entire war into a cruel joke. A cold silence swept over the command pod. The officers who had once stood proudly beside Varnus now seemed unsure, their faces pale, their gazes distant. The Kzarran fleet was broken, its forces scattered and crippled. There was no hope of redemption, no chance of recovery. The Kzarran Empire had been undone by a species that had nothing to lose but everything to gain. Varnus took a deep breath, his throat tight. He turned slowly to face his officers, their eyes searching his for guidance. But there was no guidance left to give. His empire was crumbling before him, its might shattered by the humans who had fought with everything they had. And now they were not just survivors. They were victors. He stepped forward, his voice softer now, a quiet resolve settling in. "We thought we were the apex. We thought our technology, our might, would bring us victory. But we were wrong. These humans, they have done what no one else has ever done. They've turned the very game we play into something we can't understand." There was no defiance in his tone, no denial, just the cold, hard truth. The humans had won, and there was nothing Varnus could do to stop them. "They've beaten us," Varnus continued, his words weighted with a deep, painful realization. "Not because they have more power or better technology, but because they've learned. They've adapted in ways we can't even begin to comprehend." Greth, standing at his side, said nothing, but her eyes shone with a mixture of disbelief and respect. The Kzarran Empire, for all its strength, had not seen this kind of warfare before. No one had. The humans had transformed warfare into an art form, blending ingenuity with instinct, using their weaknesses to fuel their strength. Varnus turned back to the display, his hands gripping the console with a fierce resolve. The humans had already stripped away the last of the Kzarran pride. Now they were moving in for the final strike. But even as the Kzarran fleet began its retreat into the depths of space, Varnus felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time: respect. They're not just fighting for survival, he said, almost to himself. They're fighting because they believe they can. And they're right. They've won. And it's their time now. For the first time in his life, Varnus knew the truth. The Kzarran Empire had failed because it had underestimated the human spirit. The humans didn't just fight to survive. They fought to thrive. They had taken their planet, their weapons, their lives, and they had made them into something more. They had made it into a force that could not be ignored. And in the end, it was the humans who would rise. "Tell the fleet," Varnus ordered, his voice steady once more. "The war is over, and the humans are the victors." The message was simple, but the meaning was clear. The humans had done what no one else in the galaxy had ever dared do. They had defeated the Kzarran not just in battle, but in spirit. The universe had just witnessed the birth of a new era. As the Kzarran fleet retreated, battered and broken, Varnus Threx watched the final embers of their once mighty empire fade into the blackness of space. And in that moment, he knew, with an absolute certainty, humanity was not just a species to be feared. They were a species to be reckoned with. And in the vast, cold silence of the void, he finally understood the true meaning of the words they had sent him. "Thanks for the upgrades. Come back anytime." Humanity had not only survived, they had conquered, and they were just getting started.